with discernment, it's healthy judgment. You have to judge what is happening and the right moves to make.
What I typically go to when I have feelings, for me personally, is I pause and ponder. I take a step back and I try and think, what am I feeling, one, and then why am I feeling it? And I try and break it down so I can understand it, and then I try and put it into words.
That's where I put my North Star and how I might try to lead people at work. I might try to lead my family, and I try to even lead myself.
And if I can put it into words, then I can begin to work with them. And then I can update the inputs that create those feelings in purposeful ways. So we have to take time to pause and ponder those feelings. Why? And if we can put them into words, it helps us use or change or create more positively.
If you're a man that controls his own destiny, a man that is always in the pursuit of being better, you are in the right place. You are responsible. You are strong. You are a leader. You are a force for good. Gentlemen, you are the Alpha, and this is the Alpha Quorum.
Welcome back to the Alpha Quorum Show. Brad Singletary here. You guys, this is going to be a stunner of a show right now. Our guest today was born and raised in Southern California as the oldest of 5 kids. Since high school, he's lived in Hawaii, Honduras, Belize, Utah, Ohio, Alabama, and now Las Vegas. He's been married 16 years and has 2 boys, ages 12 and 9. He received a bachelor's degree in business from Brigham Young University, a medical doctorate from The Ohio State University, and completed his residency training in anesthesiology from the University of Alabama, Birmingham. He's a practicing anesthesiologist in a busy practice in Las Vegas, taking care of some of the sickest patients in the biggest surgeries that are done in this city. He loves to travel, get outside. He loves to explore and experience new things, and he does that with his family, everywhere from Miami to Anchorage and even out of the country. He loves the ocean. He says it is therapy for him. So whether he's surfing in Hawaii, kayaking in Key Largo, or scuba diving in Belize, he has to get into the ocean. He's fascinated with history and war. He spent years reading and studying the world wars and conflicts that have followed. He's currently addicted to everything in the Russia versus Ukraine conflict. He loves learning and will continue to pursue learning forever. Gentlemen, I am so proud to introduce Dr. Rockford Wright.
You call me Rocky.
Rocky!
I've been Rocky since kindergarten. And eventually I'm going to grow into that name. But
that is the coolest name ever. So your wife married Dr. Wright.
Yeah, well,
Mr. Wright, Dr. Wright.
So I was Mr. Wright at the time, and she went through the struggle of being poor students, and we've come out through that tunnel, and now we're living life in a different way. Similar things, but a little bit different. But yeah, so she's been with me through the whole time.
So anesthesiology. So you put people to sleep. Is that what you do?
Wait, that's the easy part, right?
That's the easy part.
So we get
Keeping
paid.
them barely alive.
We get paid to wake them up. Right?
Okay.
So
yes, please. That will be important.
Yeah. So as an anesthesiologist, my job is to facilitate a patient's safety, and then also facilitate a patient's ability or a surgeon's ability to perform a surgery. So oftentimes that requires what we call general anesthesia, going off to sleep, waking up when it's all done. And it's my job to keep someone safe and comfortable through that process, despite whatever turbulence may come in that process.
So I just have to explain what is happening here in this room. I feel like a sports like radio announcer where you can't see, and they're describing, the team is moving from right to left, and they describe visually what's going on. So on my left, I have Mike Olsen, who's fresh out of church here in his church clothes, and he's always dapper as always, but he's got these socks on, and he pulls up the socks, and it's Tupac socks.
They're my Tupac church socks.
That's so awesome. This looks like a a GQ. What is that? Gentleman's Quarterly in here. These are some good looking dudes in here. I feel special just that I get to hang out with these guys. And Rocky, you had some connection to Tupac. You had some people who knew about Tupac.
Yeah. So it's a small community here with medicine in Las Vegas, even though it's a growing city. But yeah, I work with a surgeon that took care of Tupac when he was shot. So firsthand witness told me that he indeed died.
He did die.
He is dead, unfortunately, I guess. But so we can squash that rumor.
So tell us about your. How long have you been in Las Vegas?
Coming up on 6 years. 6
years in Las Vegas, and you kind of said, I don't know if you said that in the intro, or if I read that on your website somewhere, that you've kind of settled in. You're making this your home for now. This is where you plan to be for a while.
Yeah, we bounced around a lot. You mentioned it. I've lived in a number of different cities, all the main time zones in the United States. But this is it now. We're settling in, so we're here for the foreseeable future.
Well, I really appreciate you being here. I've wanted to get you on this show for a long time, and sorry to kind of spring this on you yesterday. You had like 24 hours, and Rocky and I were in a meeting probably about a year ago where we both had an assignment to talk, and I ended up taking the entire time, and he was prepared and ready for his speech, and the meeting was over. So I have to promise today, Mike and I, we got to keep a lid on it a little bit today and let Dr. Wright here, Rocky, take it over. So we've been doing this series on the Red 9. The Red 9 are just attributes that I believe that represent the best in men. So responsibility, being resourceful, being reverent, maintaining energy, being engaged with your life, having a sense of endurance. We've most recently talked about discipline. Tonight, we're talking about discernment. I've been excited to talk about this, and the more I've thought about it in preparation, I realized how deep this entire subject is. So just looking at some definitions of what it means to be discerning, I found a couple things. Basically, that it means to be able to tell things apart, to make insightful observations about things. In mental health, that's my primary employment. Insight means that you're basically aware of and accept the fact that you have an illness. So someone, for example, who, let's say they have schizophrenia and they don't recognize that their hallucinations aren't reality, we would say they lack insight, or they have low insight or no insight. So maybe discernment in its biggest, broadest term is about awareness. It's about insight. It's about judging in a way that is healthy. So Rocky, when I threw this topic at you, what kinds of things came to mind for you as I shared this topic?
Well, at first I wondered where this was going to go, because discernment can apply to a lot of things. And the first few little blurbs that you sent me, I felt like I really connected with. Some self-awareness and working through problematic thoughts and feelings. And I was like, yeah, that resonates with me. This is something I actively do. I have been a learner for a long time. I was in school for basically 17 years after high school. And so the learning process is something that I'm deeply connected to. And a part of that was learning about myself as I went through it. And in my path, as we may get to later, kind of, navigated its way and made some turns. And so I felt like I could resonate with that. But then there were some other things that I questioned if I was a good person to talk about this with. Like you mentioned here, noticing the difference between flavors. Like, I'm not a foodie. I can't tell the difference between flavors. Like that's not my thing. And so, can I discern? And so then I was questioning, well, is this something that I can talk about? And I think what I got to was, no one is an expert in all things, and no one is going to master all things, but we can focus on things where we do feel comfortable, where we do need to grow, we do need to progress, and highlight those. So that's what I'm going to try to do today. I want to highlight things that I have more comfort with. And then the other thing that I thought of was really breaking this down into some of its smaller pieces. Even these smaller pieces can be incredibly deep things. When we're talking about truth, and when we're talking about bias, and when we're talking about some of these things we'll get to, you can dive deep into this. And there you could have multiple PhDs who have dedicated a career to studying these things and not agree on them. So, in a podcast, we're not going to cover all of the depth. There's no way that any of us could talk about all of the things, but I hope that we can get some good things out of this. I'm confident that we will. So in some ways I was intimidated. There's a lot here. There's a lot to unpackage, but I think there's a lot of good here.
You guys, that is a compliment. I mean, this guy's like top of the food chain in the medical world as an anesthesiologist. Well, I don't know exactly how that works, but I would consider you a highly esteemed, I know some guys fall at the bottom of that, those, I know anesthesiology is up there pretty high. So here's one of the brightest guys that I know. We run in some similar circles, and I've heard him speak and teach, and it's just impressive the way he processes and shares information. So I'm excited about this. Mike, any general thoughts before we get digging down into the details here about discernment overall, what that is to you?
For me, discernment, I try to identify where is discernment useful to me in my life, or if I'm talking to someone else, where would discernment be useful to them in their life? For example, in my world, in the e-commerce world, and in the fulfillment world, there are still a lot of employees, and it's just the nature of the beast where we use a lot of manual labor. It's not the highest paid labor. We might have some higher paid leads or additional supervisors, but a lot of times we have to use lower paid wage earners. And I really do enjoy the association with people in general. And then there's a lot of times where if you have people at the top earning capacity, they're generally very, very good with people. If you have them at the bottom of the earning capacity, they're not as experienced. I don't want to say that they're not good with people. They're not as experienced with people. But there are plenty at that level that are used to just skating by. They're used to just telling you what you think you want to hear. And so that's really become a useful tool to me to be able to understand I have a particular goal that I have to reach from a production standpoint, whatever it might be. And I have to rely on people to accomplish that production. And so as I'm talking to these people, asking them, can I rely on you to show up to work? Can I rely on you to accomplish these tasks? I try to make it as clear as possible and as short as possible. Here's what I need from you. Here's when I need it. Here's the quality that I need. Can I rely on you? And there are plenty of times when, yeah, I can do that. Yeah. Or they might show up late to work 2 or 3 times in a row. Oh, yeah. And they'll have all kinds of excuses. And so this kind of applies, I might be using this particular experience from a labor standpoint in the work field, but it does apply to, I think, all of our relationships, because even at the top, if you want to call it food earners, the top of the food chain in the labor force, or even the highest paid people, you get used to trying to discern, is this person telling me a lie? Are they really telling me the truth? And you have to kind of say, all right, I'm going to believe you, but this trust, if it's a new relationship and you have to develop this trust, can I believe you? If I really need you to perform and you don't perform, what's the backup plan that I can create so that you're following through and not doing what you say you're going to do does not hurt things that I'm going to be paid for, things that I'm going to be judged against? Yeah,
so with discernment, it's healthy judgment. So many times we find ourselves in a place of judgment. You have to judge what is happening and the right moves to make. And I'm sure, Rocky, in the medical world, you're doing the same. Before we dive into the things we judge externally, the people and situations around us, I want to look at the self-awareness part. I talked about mental health, and insight is basically understanding and accepting that you have some problem. What is the importance of understanding our own biases, our tendencies, and bad habits and so forth? Because just as an example to open that question up, if I am a person who jumps the gun often, I need to know when I'm walking into a heated situation, now look, Brad, you've got a bad habit of jumping the gun. Don't do that here. And so in order for me to be a fair judge, I have to understand my own strengths and weaknesses. So what's the importance of self-awareness, particularly with like biases, your own personal tendencies, Rocky?
So honestly, when I first saw this as a potential topic of discussion, I felt some frustration and really didn't want to talk about it. And I told my wife, like, I don't really want to talk about biases. And she said, why not? And that was a good question because it had to get me thinking. And I really had to put my feelings or transition feelings about frustration with bias into actual words. I had to reason through it so that I could work with those words. And this is a skill that may come up a few times today because it applies to discernment incredibly. And it's actually something I actively work on. In this case, I was able to take a step back and pause and ponder that frustration and really discover the reason I didn't even like the discussion or the idea of the discussion of bias. So rather than skip talking about it, I'm going to go on a little bit of a rant instead, if that's okay.
Yeah, you bet.
So basically, I feel like the discussion of bias too often in kind of our public sphere is used as a tool of attack. And it seems like it's discussing bias and it plays out in kind of two ways. One is, if you disagree with me, it's because you are biased. Therefore, you are wrong and your opinion is invalid. Or number two, it's presented as you have a bias, so you better feel bad about that and get educated. And usually that means get educated until you agree with them. And that's so frustrating to me because we all have preconceived ideas with incomplete information. So it seems like it's a manipulating tool of attack if they basically say, okay, bias is bad, you have bias, so you are bad. And that discussion is so pervasive right now. I mean, even my 12-year-old son, who really doesn't have many deep thoughts at all, he saw something in a show that we were watching and a character did something bad and he was like, that's so biased. I mean, he doesn't even understand that word, but believed it was synonymous with bad. So let me dare to break the mold and risk being taken out of context, which I hope doesn't happen, but here goes. I don't think we should feel such damaging guilt or beat ourselves up in unproductive ways because of our biases. So there, I said it. But that doesn't mean that we can't or shouldn't address it. And based on some preparatory notes that you sent me, I see that you likely agree with me, that there can actually be positive discussion with regard to bias. Now, I tread this direction with the disclaimer that I am not a psychologist, that I have not committed to a career in this study of these things, but I express my opinion on the matter. So I want to start with painting a picture of what I think is the context or background. And hopefully we can agree on most of this for this first part, which is that there are survival benefits for us as a species to recognize patterns based on input of information throughout our lives to help us prepare or even predict the future in a way that is productive. So let me give us some examples. Let's say that we have hunters in Africa thousands of years ago. So they shouldn't be expected to check with each lion individually to see if the next lion is actually really a threat, right? It's beneficial for the hunter to prejudge each lion as a threat. Or let's talk about pain. So as an anesthesiologist, I deal with pain every day, and pain's a fascinating thing in itself. We could talk about pain for a long time, but for the purpose of this conversation, it serves a survival benefit or purpose that even my 12-year-old friends recognized this weekend when we went camping. So we were camping by some boulders, and a group of these kids were climbing all over them and were beginning to test the boundaries of their capabilities. And one slipped eventually, and fell, scraped up his hands and wrists, and then he comes to me, and I'm the doctor dad, right? So he comes to me for help, and as I'm cleaning him up and bandaging him, he says, "I just wish we didn't feel pain." And in my response was, well, pain actually has a purpose. And then he says, without additional prompting, he says, yeah, I guess it helps us know what we shouldn't do. It's like, dang, deep thoughts from a 12-year-old, right? That it's protective, that pain can actually be protective sometimes. So we experience pain in situations so that we can learn and then prejudge a similar situation in the future to avoid destructive results. So these are examples of how humans can learn patterns to prejudge a situation or risk in order to promote self-preservation. So that same can be said in the opposite with positive reinforcement, allowing for the prejudging of a situation in a favorable direction. So we're built to prejudge to a degree rather than learn each time anew if something is good or bad, dangerous or helpful. So let's get to the dictionary definition of bias. I wanted to look this up, make sure I was, being accurate and whatnot. So if you Google, the first result in Google is a prejudice in favor of or against one thing, person, or group compared with another. So prejudice has a negative connotation, which kind of like bias has a negative connotation. I couldn't think of another English word that means to prejudge something that doesn't have a severely negative connotation. Maybe preconception was the most benign. But all the rest of the synonyms that I could find, the rest were pretty clearly negative. Bigotry, discrimination, xenophobia. So that's a fault or flaw in our modern language of definitions, right? Can you guys think of a word that means to prejudge something that isn't associated with being an awful human being by today's standards?
I'm trying to think.
Assess.
So that's different. Assess is something you're doing in real time, right? This is before you've collected the information or all of the information.
Okay.
So I would agree. Assess is a positive thing. That's something we're going to talk about that more later.
I wonder about assimilate. Maybe that's not, it's like filtering what I'm experiencing through what I already know. Is that the right word?
How about
Assimilate?
expect?
Okay. So expect. Yeah. So that's kind of predict. Yeah.
That's what I had in mind when you mentioned a word that talks about judging. I had in mind, and I'm looking at the word bias, and I guess I had never, this is just my own opinion, I'd never really associated bias negatively, which according to the definition that you read, Rocky, I agree. That's what bias or prejudice might be. I had just had in mind it was an expectation or a prediction based upon incomplete information.
Okay, so if that were all, then that wouldn't be negative.
Correct. I can see that.
I only read half the definition. So here's the other half of the definition. So we'll start from the beginning. Prejudice, which already has a negative connotation. Just using that word has a negative connotation. Prejudice in favor of or against one thing, person, or group compared with another. Here's the rest of it. Usually in a way considered to be unfair.
Is prejudice a portion of a word prejudge? I don't know. I'm just thinking that.
Yeah,
Probably
I think
its origin,
yeah.
right? But if you look at synonyms and the way that prejudice is used now, it is always negative.
I can't think of another way. I can't see it positive. Prejudice has always seemed, from my experience and the feedback that I'm getting from the world, to be negative. Yeah.
Particularly with like racial prejudice.
So that's where we hear it in the public sphere most commonly. So here we have this context of how we need to be able to prejudge for protective purposes, right? We need to be able to learn and recognize patterns. And that comes up a lot in anesthesia too. And maybe we'll get to that. But yeah, but all of our words to describe it, this necessary part of how we exist, are all negative. Prejudice is negative. Bias is negative based on all of the definitions, and I feel like what is our common usage. So we go into this discussion with the context of this is bad, right? So that unfair part that we have to talk a little bit about. So let's unpackage the unfair part. This is a gray area, right? So what makes someone's prejudice unfair? There's a ton of subjectivity here. On rare occasions, I have female patients who refuse to let me treat them simply because I am a man before they even see me. Is that fair? A lot of debate could be had about that. Maybe. I don't know.
Maybe there's a difference between fair and accurate.
Well, the accuracy is that that's what they require. So this is a subjective thing. There's subjectivity here. Mm-hmm. So that's what I'm saying is it fair for that person to require that a female take care of them? We could talk about that for a while. The point is it's gray here. I mentioned in the intro, it was mentioned that I'm kind of into war stuff, and I've been sucked into this Russia-Ukraine conflict, so today is Sunday, April 24th. So this began February 24th when Russia invaded Ukraine. So we're exactly 2 months out from the invasion, or the beginning of the invasion. So if a Ukrainian sees a Russian soldier coming towards them, is it unfair for that Ukrainian to prejudge that soldier as a threat?
No.
Well, we say certainly not.
Right.
But by a lot of the standards that we say we should interact with people, we should not prejudge people. Now, I understand that a war, a conflict is not the workplace. I understand that the analogy is not perfect. I'm just talking about principles and how gray this unfair prejudging situation or difficult it may be to assess the fairness.
So you're kind of saying you not only have the right to, but you better prejudge. You better be looking ahead. You better be trying to anticipate a threat or something painful.
I'm saying it is absolutely natural to us.
Natural. I think especially when you take timing into account, would it be fair to assess that that is a threat, a Russian soldier coming towards a Ukrainian citizen, we'll just use that as an example, now would be absolutely necessary. 20 years ago, probably not. 20 years from now, likely not, in that situation.
Yeah, we hope. You're right. So really, we can only deal with our right now. We can't make decisions from 20 years ago. We have to make decisions now. And so in a protective way, we recognize patterns to be able to predict threats or predict opportunities, that is in our nature. It's built into us. So this whole intro was basically to get to the summary points of the background that we are built for good reason to prejudge situations, including interactions with other people. And these patterns we use are guided by our own experience or information input via teaching from someone else. And we don't have a word for prejudging that has any positive connotation. And really applying the definition of prejudgment as being unfair is really a complex thing. So that's kind of the summary of all this stuff that I've been saying. So because of all of that, I don't think we should immediately jump to destructive guilt because we might have prejudgments.
I agree.
All of that story to get to that point. If we beat ourselves up or if we tear ourselves down because of our biases, because of our prejudgments, because of our tendencies, that's more destructive than good. And part of that probably comes from the way that we are built. So what I do think now, so that's one point. Now we have to transition to the positive, productive direction that we need to take this. And I do think that we need to recognize that what we need to recognize is that the information we use to prejudge can be updated. It can be altered. It can be changed. And that's maybe where some of your time comes into, because that time gives more experience, more opportunity, more change.
It's live. It's you're constantly updating that assessment.
We should be, and we can continually be learning, but it usually takes at least a little effort to make that progress. If we are purposeful in our pursuit of it, then we will definitively be updating our paradigm, the way we see people, the way that we see the world, the way that we see things.
Give me an example, Rocky, of what you mean by we should be making an effort to update that. Like, give me like a real world example.
So an example that came up with my wife and I don't want to get into like hot topics or politics.
This is the oven. We're fine with hot topics in here.
Okay.
Because editing works perfectly in this world.
So one example that came up, sometimes we struggle to have productive conversations about politically charged topics, and immigration can be one of those. So my wife and I, we get along really well, but it was interesting because we struggled a little bit to talk about immigration because we were coming at it from very different angles, very different directions. She lived in Utah and grew up there. She had traveled a little bit, not to South America, but she'd been to Israel once. Anyway, but her life was primarily in Utah. I served a mission for my church in Central America, in Honduras. If you know anything about caravans coming through Mexico to the United States, you have probably heard that a lot of them are coming from Honduras. These are the people that I lived with for 2 years. I'm not saying specific individuals, but I'm saying that region. So I lived with these people. I was in their homes. I talked to these people. And interestingly, I could tell as soon as I walked into someone's home if they had a relative in the United States.
How?
Right off, because they lived better. They lived better than their neighbor. They had better stuff than their neighbor. Life was better for them because they had a relative in the United States. And so then I put myself in the position, usually at that point, 20 years ago, it was historically, and before that, was men. The men came to the United States to be able to earn money to
send back.
Send back.
Got it. Okay.
So those families that lived better oftentimes had a husband, father, brother that lived in the United States. And then I put myself in their position. If I was that dad and I knew that if I could find a way to get to this other place, my family would be better off, would I be willing to take that risk? Absolutely changed my perspective of immigration to the United States. My wife hadn't been able to put herself in that position, hadn't had the same opportunity. So we can seek out, I'm not saying you have to go live in a village in Honduras like I did. I'm not saying you have to do that. But it is useful to try and put ourselves in other people's shoes, and we have to understand other people better. That updates the information we use to make decisions about other people and to evaluate other people.
So let me ask you this. So you're saying that was the contextual conversation between you and your wife, you were for immigration, you understood why they did it, and she may have been against it and more protective. Not that I'm trying to look at your opinion being right. I'm just trying to understand your judgment of immigration compared to your wife's, because I'm sure that this is very common. You'll have people in the same family who will have two opposing thoughts on the same topic.
Yeah, so it wasn't that I was for or against immigration or that she was for or against immigration. The question was more, we both agreed that a controlled, legalized mechanism for immigration is best.
Got it.
We both agreed
Okay.
on that. But what I was able to do was feel a sense of sympathy for the people that circumvented the current mechanism to enter the country.
Got it.
She had trouble sympathizing with that because she could see the rule being broken.
Understood.
It was
Okay.
hard for her to connect to a real deep connection with why. And that's what I was able to do.
She saw her side of the border and the application or the breaking of the rule. You saw the other side of the border and the application or the breaking of the rule, and you had two different contextualized experiences. She's not coming at it from an experience of, I see the benefit of this human being having a friend or a relative in the United States. I can empathize with that. Not empathizing with breaking the rule, but you understood the result.
Yeah, and
Okay.
my wife is an incredibly caring, loving, generous person. So it's not that she was cold-hearted. There is just a deeper level of connection when you understand more personally what someone else is experiencing.
Cool.
I just want to take note of something that you've done here. You've said the word understand about 50 times today. And I think that that's a big part of what discernment really is. Understanding. Do you see it? Do you understand? I heard somewhere that the only people that you don't like are the people that you don't understand. And when you talk about being in those homes in Honduras, there had to be some openness on your part to say, and I don't know if you had a very different perspective before. This is a great example, by the way. I love this example because I think our audience will really connect to that particular thing in one way or the other. But there had to be some openness on your part to say, I'm noticing something here. I'm noticing a pattern. I'm noticing there's information here. What can I make of it? And maybe I was wrong before. Maybe there is more to the story than what I previously knew or thought that I knew. That's a great example to me of someone who's developing discernment from, what were you, 19 years old?
Yeah, 19 to 21.
And I don't even think it's as much of being right or wrong. It's just his circumstance gave him additional insight.
Don't you know there's some other kids from here in the States who were there and had the same stimulus in front of them and did not perceive it that way?
Could be, yeah.
They just
I'm sure.
They continued in their belief about that topic, or the.
And I don't think we should say that they just continued. Sometimes this takes purposeful pursuits. Learning is, we're used to entertainment in very passive ways, like we sit there and a screen shows us stuff, but really learning, really understanding is a purposeful pursuit. It takes energy and effort, not necessarily, lifting bricks kind of effort. It's not muscular, but it's brain energy. And I guess I've been blessed with a little bit of curiosity, which made the process more fulfilling. So I was willing to exert that energy.
And put yourself in their shoes.
Yeah.
So much of what happens with discernment or believing that we understand something or trying to understand is we project our own issues onto people. We displace our feelings, to the wrong person or the wrong situation. That I guess a dumb example would be, the guy gets yelled at work and he comes home and yells at his kids. He needs to be aware that, hey, I'm walking into my home right now upset. I'm walking into my situation with some vulnerability toward, anger or aggression, and this wouldn't be fair to my children and my family here. So other thoughts on awareness or the ability to be aware of biases? I don't know if we finished your thoughts there, Rocky.
Well, the other thing I was just going to, kind of what I started with, when even just addressing why I felt frustrated with the idea of talking about bias, what I went to was what I typically go to when I have feelings, for me personally, is I pause and ponder. So I pause and ponder, and I pursue that often, like I said. So, and this pause and pondering, I take a step back and I try and think, what am I feeling, one, and then why am I feeling it? And I try and break it down so I can understand it. And then I try and put it into words. And if I can put it into words, then I can begin to work with them. And then I can update the inputs that create those feelings in purposeful ways. So the technique that I would say I started with in this story, and then we could apply in other situations, is this pause and ponder. And again, this is the mental energy that I talk about. We have to exert a little bit of it. We got to step back and pause and ponder. So whether it's how we enter the room when we come home, whether it's how we tend to respond to different things, we have to take time to pause and ponder those feelings. Why? And if we can put them into words, it helps us use or change or create more positively.
You talked about some politically charged things there, and I just feel like there's so many things out there, from politics to diets to different things. There's so much information. So everyone is trying to get an audience. Look, we're even doing that ourselves, but there's just so many attempts to gain people's attention and lead them in one direction or the other. How in the world do we make sense of all of the information that we have, all the ideas? There's a million explanations for everything under the sun. What do we do? How do we find our way with these subjective things that are kind of these opinions?
All the options
presented. The opinions that are presented as facts.
Yeah, so this is a huge bite or chunk to take on, because we are so overwhelmed with access to information. More than any other time in the history of the world, we have information. Our difficulty is not, can we get information? It's how do we decipher it, right? And so step one for me is recognizing that there is, in fact, a difference between fact and opinion. And most of what we hear is opinion. So cable news is a perfect example of this. I read a book called Hate, Inc. It was written by a Rolling Stones journalist for 30 years, and he's a little provocative. I mean, he wrote for Rolling Stones, so he's a little loose with the language and whatnot. But he talks about the progression of the divide in our public sphere, specifically with politics, that reached a fever pitch with Trump. And so he talks about a lot about why that happened and the economics behind it, the cultural movement behind it. Anyway, but there's a takeaway. For one of the takeaways for me was that we as individuals, as people, as a society, we like simple stories for even super complex situations. And provocative simple stories get our attention. So, but the problem is that truth is almost always more complex. So much more complex. But we're used to that article title that's a blurb, that's provocative, and that's where we're used to consuming. But the truth is usually so much more complex. So second, getting and giving opinion is easy. Getting and giving fact takes work, and it takes a lot of work. And most people aren't willing to put forth the work.
What did you say there? Go back again about the simple explanation, simple explanations.
So what I said was that we like simple stories for even super complex situations.
Yeah, let me just tell you real quick what this was. This was the idea. Some doctor out there was saying that COVID was king cobra venom that has been placed in the water by the powers that be, and that we're all drinking cobra venom.
And this was something, you're not talking hypothetical, you're talking authentic snake venom?
Yeah, like they've, I guess, farmed all these king cobras and they put the venom in the water, and that's why certain zip codes got it worse, because they wanted to send more their way. Anyway, that's a simple story. It's a simple thing, and we love that kind of stuff.
Sensationalism sells.
Yes.
So would you say that was a doctor that was credited with that?
Yes.
Of some sort. So yeah, so the title of that article is Doctor Says COVID is Cobra Venom. In 8 words, however many I said, we could summarize that. It's provocative, it's opinion, and that's what we consume.
It's attention grabbing.
Yeah, that's the provocative part. So yeah, this is what we're used to consuming, right?
Clickbait.
That is not helpful. It's attractive, but it's actually not helpful when we're trying to navigate opinion versus fact. We are used to consuming provocative opinions. All right, so I grew up a little bit in the science world. I'm a physician, right? So we get exposure to the sciences. So I have to talk about science because it applies here. Science is the systematic process of gaining knowledge, and but I have to talk about the scientific process because we got in the last 2 years with COVID, we have gotten a lot of science talk by not science people.
A bunch of armchair quarterbacks.
Yeah. So we have to understand some things about man's pursuit of knowledge and how science works, that scientific process. So first, I have to say that science, when it's pursuing answers to a question, is not definitive at first. Eventually, it becomes definitive, or much more so, but it never starts being definitive, or it is never definitive at the start. And it rarely progresses in a linear way. So let me give you an example from anesthesia. So I do anesthesia for heart surgeries, open heart surgeries. So these big surgeries, sometimes they take up to 12 hours, and it's a big strain, big stress on the body. We want to make sure that these surgeries go well. It's my job to keep people safe. And so there's a lot of study that have gone into anesthesia, what we need to do in anesthesia to keep someone safe. So I'm going to use the airplane analogy for anesthesia to help people understand just a little bit. So, because we kind of work in the shadows, anesthesia. People don't really understand what we do, which is fine. We basically go to sleep and then you wake up, right? So here, the analogy with flight, which we like to use a lot, which people are much more familiar with, is a plane takes off, gets to cruising altitude, and then lands, right? We're familiar with that. Mm-hmm. That's basically what anesthesia is too, except that rather than take off, it's go to sleep. Then we get into the surgery and we kind of cruise along at cruising altitude. Occasionally there's some turbulence, usually not. And then we land, which is the wake up. So that's the analogy for anesthesia. Now that cruising altitude or that cruising experience when we're at altitude, we use a medicine that people breathe typically to keep people steady at that cruising altitude. That's kind of the fuel of the airplane. For us, that's the medicine that keeps people asleep. They're getting it with every breath. It's a gas that they breathe. So with cardiac surgery, they started with, we'll call it medicine A. And decades ago, they said medicine A is the best medicine for the fuel of the plane at cruising altitude, or to keep someone asleep for a heart surgery cruising along through the middle of the process, medicine A is the best. And there were some studies that supported that. And then they did more studies and they said, well, actually, no, medicine B is better. So then for a decade or so, we switched over to medicine B as the fuel for cruising altitude. And then more studies were done and said, well, actually, medicine A has this additional cardioprotective or heart protective property that we weren't aware of when we did our first studies, but now we're seeing it now. So now we're back to medicine A. And that's the path that science took us. We went from medicine A to medicine B, back to medicine A. And so we have to understand that sometimes science doesn't take a linear direction. Science is fluid in some ways. So then I want to use one more analogy. So again, science is the collection of knowledge and information. It's the development of fact. So if we understand that sometimes that development of fact doesn't come linearly, that we sometimes have to work through some things, then hopefully we'll have a little bit more patience, and hopefully we'll also be a little bit more flexible and maybe a little bit less absolute opinionated as we're still developing or collecting the information. So the analogy that I want to give for science is with fluidity is surfing. So I grew up in California and I lived in Hawaii and loved to surf. And I surfed on the North Shore. And I am not a professional surfer. I'm not surfing these huge waves. The biggest waves I surfed were 12 feet tall.
If you did it once, you're a badass. So, you don't have to be a professional.
You didn't drown. You're successful.
Yes.
Yeah. So to put in perspective, like a 12-foot wave, so that's bigger than a one-story house. And again, as you're paddling into this, or you're standing at the top, you stand up at the top of this 12-foot house, your head is actually, closer to 17 or 20 feet tall. So you're looking down from 20 feet down a wall of water. And I fell once and I skipped along that wave like someone had, like an inner tube being pulled by a boat that gets flung out, and you just skip along the water. That happened to me. So anyway, just to describe the size, force, and power of these waves. So that's just for fun. But that's my credentials. I have surfed a 12-foot wave. All right, so now I can talk about surfing because I have some credentials with it. So surfing is an interesting thing because you are riding on moving water. You talk about fluid, it's dynamic. It is moving, and you cannot predict exactly where that wave is going to go. You have to adapt, and you have to be able to sense changes and move with those changes. You have to be flexible. Science is somewhat like that. You have to be fluid and somewhat flexible while you're still collecting the information. You have to be like a surfer that doesn't know exactly where that wave is going to get to, and you have to move with it and ride with it as you develop and collect the information that will eventually be fact.
Interesting.
So as we have all of this stuff in front of us, what do you recommend? I mean, when we have all this information, we talked about more than ever in the history of the world, we're just bombarded with mostly opinion. Earlier in the section before, you talked about pause and ponder. What do we do with all this information?
So I think I don't have perfect answers for this, and this is ultimately the golden nugget is figuring that out. And I don't know that I brought gold today, but I think that like I mentioned, we need to be fluid. We need to be at least a little bit flexible. We need to be patient. We shouldn't attack each other when we don't have all the information. We should diversify our streams so that we can get information from different places. And then we need to be, there needs to be a somewhat caring, compassionate approach to some of this, that we are hopefully on a team trying to understand and get better. But of course, as that book Hate Eat talks about, that is the exact opposite of the ways that we are pushed. So I guess my takeaway would be, let's pursue some patience. Let's try and be civil, but let's also understand that we are still learning. We are still gaining knowledge. We are still trying to establish many of the facts.
I think something that some people struggle with is kind of almost paranoia. You know, there's the system, there's the man, there's the government who's controlling everything. You know, the guy that talked about the cobra venom and whatever, there's probably millions and millions of people who watch that, and half of those probably believe it. So what is the balance between not being naive and also not being paranoid? I mean, maybe there are some things that we ought to be cautious about. There are some things in our history. You talked about world wars and different things in the history of mankind that have been terrible and tragic. But how do we also not run around paranoid and believing the sky is falling, but be tuned in?
Yeah, so we have to, I don't know that I have a perfect answer for this. My answer has been to find a balance between the virtual or digital world and the real physical world. So if we live in a Twitter sphere, we are going to be exposed to a nonstop barrage of attacks and potentially, vile things. Now, not that that's all that Twitter is, but in that sphere, that digital sphere, it is built to attack in many ways, and 160 characters, what have you. And like we talked about earlier, sensationalism and being provocative sells. So that digital world that's clamoring for your attention is going to be provocative. It is going to push things that trigger paranoia. I worked with here in Las Vegas. She's a nurse, and her husband is one of the broadcasters for the news here locally. And she said that they would chart the number of people tuning in based on the story that they showed. And they could see when they went super negative, tune in, shut up. As soon as they started talking about positive things, like look at this food bank and what they're doing locally or whatever, attention dropped off. They are incentivized to sell negative because, and potentially this is a protective mechanism for us as a species, we need to be aware of threats. So maybe we are keenly attuned to threat and danger. Now, what that does for us now is it provokes anxiety, and we live in this world of anxiety. So what I would do when I was kind of swallowed up in some of that digital provocation, I would turn around and look at the physical people that I was actually interacting with when the world was falling, when racial tensions were out of this world. And then I looked at the people that I actually physically interacted with, and I didn't experience that face to face. And it regrounded me in the reality of my interaction with people that was not nearly as anxiety provoking. Now, I know that people do go through struggles, and I know that there are tensions. But for me personally, the physical, actual, what I would call even more real connection that you make with people is not nearly as anxiety provoking as the digital sphere. So if it's just a simple matter of balancing time between the two, then I think that would be beneficial.
So interesting. You're talking about the digital, what was the phrase you used before, that you were in this digital negativity or something? All that is so abstract. And even if what is being described sometimes is really accurately happening, or it's some description of something that is a phenomenon that is actually occurring, if we look at our own world, our own sphere, you're talking about the real live people, in real life, you didn't experience that. Abstract versus reality. In Ray Dalio's book, Principles, I think his first principle, or the first bullet point under his first principle, was recognize reality. You have to see reality. And some of what we're being sold is an idea. It's an emotion. I always say that, these news outlets, they sell Toyotas and potato chips. It's all just for listeners and for viewers. And if they can, they're selling emotion, basically, is what they're selling, not information.
And I think that is one of the key points to remember here. What Rocky is talking about, what you just mentioned. Do you know who Ray Dalio is, Brad?
Mm-hmm.
Do you know who Ray Dalio is, Rocky? Ray Dalio is probably one of the quiet guys behind the scenes who has led up until the last few years and managed the largest hedge fund the world has ever seen. Well, at least in America. And I think as Americans, that's the wonderful thing about it. You mentioned Honduras, and if you lived in America, because it has the structure for capitalism to be maximized above all else if you want it to. And it can be done in a negative way. And Ray Dalio has managed the largest hedge fund, the most valuable hedge fund that America has ever seen. And I think that's the thing to keep in mind. And that's when you talk about the Twitter sphere and the world of e-commerce that I'm in, is the fact that negativity sells. And why does negativity sells? It gains eyeballs. Negativity gains eyeballs, and through Facebook, through Instagram, through all of these different social media platforms, accessibility to eyeballs, and therefore the value for anyone selling anything on the internet, in e-commerce. You now have a main line. If you want to talk about medicine and drugs, you have a main line to someone's wallet if you can get to their eyeballs. Showing something to someone through Instagram or through an ad, 2 taps later, they can order it and it can be at their house within 24 to 48 hours sometimes.
It's important for it to be emotional.
It's very advantageous to someone selling things. Now, also as a consumer, I actually enjoy that, but discerning the difference between when someone is actually trying to provide you a product or when they don't care what they're providing you as long as they make money, being able to discern between those two things, I think we have to have some sort of North Star so that we can strip away, we can identify this is negative. I don't need to be part of that. I need to add a little more physical face-to-face to my world because that betters my world. Or, hey, this is something that is digital and I do want to participate in that, and I can zero in on the things that match up with my North Star, the principles that I feel are most important in my life, that are beneficial, that I want to keep, and the things that I want to strip away and try to ignore. That, I think, is where I think a lot of us try to get to. But if we don't know what our North Star is, if we don't know what our deep core principles are, it's easy to get fooled and distracted by all of the other things that are just trying to get at our attention.
That's a great segue into the next part, which is about how we can decide what is right or true. In the mindfulness literature out there, a very popular thing in the mental health world, especially, or the self-help world. This is kind of an Eastern philosophy about observing the world, observing your experience. Mindfulness meditation is a popular thing where you basically just observe and allow things to happen without judgment. There's no good or nor bad. And when it comes to like emotional regulation, maybe that's an important thing to do, but I think non-judgment has its place, but that doesn't work in business or in medicine or maybe in families. I mean, are there moral absolutes? How do we know what is right and wrong? If discernment is about judgment, maybe we do have to judge. Maybe all thinking is judgment. When I think about thinking, I think it is judgment. You're driving your car and you're saying, am I going to make this light? Should I speed up? Am I too close to this car? Am I going the right speed? It's judgment. We're constantly judging. That maybe is what thought is.
I think differently, that when I hear some things, I sometimes have to know, okay, this is not a popular topic or you're going to really cause some controversy. When I hear people talk, oh, you shouldn't judge that other person, I'm wondering in my own mind, I shouldn't judge them because, and then I try to understand that. I shouldn't try to judge that person because I don't know if it's right or wrong. I think I absolutely have not just the right to judge, but I have the obligation to judge if I think that is right or wrong to allow into my life. Now, to judge whether that's a terrible person or not, different topic. Mm-hmm. Or if you are on a religious vein, is that judging whether that person has a right to a heaven or a hell? Obviously, I'm not the one who judges that. I certainly shouldn't judge that for them. I don't have the right to judge that for them. I could care less because I'm not involved in their particular judgment. However, do I want that part of my life? Or if I ever come across the same scenario, do I want to behave like that? I think that I absolutely have the obligation to judge that. It doesn't mean that I'm judging that person or that I'm bad, but to judge, is this person right or wrong? This as an absolute. I like what Rocky said, because to judge that as an absolute is a dangerous thing, because there are so very few absolutes in our world, in my opinion. And just like Rocky talked about medicine A being judged as the right one to use for keeping a human at cruising altitude during a surgery, that might be found later to be a different medicine that is needed, only to go back when you learn that there were previously unknown benefits. I might have the same thing in my life, and so I have to kind of just try to say, according to my North Star, and if I have an obligation, if I am a husband, a father, and I have other people under my stewardship or my leadership or my influence, do I want to be influencing them a certain way, or do I want to be explaining to them, I might be influencing you a certain way. I'm human. It probably isn't what I truly believe, but I might have a tendency to screw up in even my own judgments of right versus wrong, so forgive me.
Yeah.
So I think another way I've heard it described is we should not make final judgments, right? And so I don't think it's fair to say this person is bad, but I think that it's fair to say this action, this thing is bad. So honestly, I'm ill-informed with the mindfulness trend that you talked about, but in talking to you about it, one of the questions that I have is, if there is no good or bad, it's just we're kind of seeing things happen, how do you reconcile that with real life consequences? So if we're aliens looking down from space and just observing, then yeah, if we're not stakeholders, then there really isn't a consequence. So there really wouldn't be good or bad. And so I think we had talked, or you had mentioned or something, there was an example of traffic or something. If you're an alien looking down at traffic, then it would just be like a congestion of machines carrying humans that usually move faster, that are moving slower this time and are a little bunched up, right? But the real life consequences are different. When there are real life consequences, we can't just be passive observers. So the example is, what if that traffic, which to an alien just looks like a congestion of little machines carrying cars or carrying humans, what if that traffic jam causes you, because you're stuck in it, to be late for work and you're fined or penalized or fired? Is that traffic jam good or bad? Well, you could very easily say, for me, this traffic jam is bad. It has a negative consequence. So, or I'm a physician, and sometimes I have to respond to emergencies that may be time sensitive. So if I'm needed for a surgery and I have to race in and I'm stuck in traffic and I can't get to help that person suffers. There's a negative consequence to this thing. Now, traffic is, maybe this isn't the best example, but it's an example of something that could very easily be described as, well, that's not good or bad. It just is what it is. But for the person experiencing the consequence, it is bad. And we experience consequence from stuff. Let me add one other thing, or mention a couple other things. So if I'm in a surgery, again, talking about the mindfulness movement, there is no good, there is no bad, it's just stuff, right? So if I'm in a surgery and a patient's heart stops, which luckily is super and incredibly rare, especially in relatively healthy people, can I look at that and say, well, that's not good or bad, it just is what it is? Of course not, right? That is bad. There are real consequences. So if you were to say that looking at the world, that there is no good and there is no bad, I don't know, again, how you reconcile that with consequences. I talked about Ukraine and Russia because I'm sucked into that. So try telling a Ukrainian mother weeping over her executed son or a Ukrainian teenager held captive and raped repeatedly, that there is no good or bad. Now, while there may be degrees of difficulty or pain or suffering or bad, to say that bad doesn't exist seems like you might be ignoring a huge part of the human existence or experience. So how do you reconcile real life consequences with this mindfulness movement? And I don't know.
I had a professor who talked about morality and what is moral. You know, we're talking about morals and ethics. And he said, here's a good question for morality. If everyone did it, what would be the consequence? I love what you're saying. The consequence is that should be what determines, or the potential consequence. Is alcohol good or bad? I think, we can say the potential consequences of that, are very bad.
I think all of those topics tie into affecting one's ability to choose. If I'm doing something to you that affects your ability to choose, then that's an entirely different topic. Someone involved in a war, and now because of the actions of someone or a group affects their ability to choose. I think that's where I put my North Star, and how I might try to lead people at work. I might try to lead my family, and I try to even, lead myself. Am I affecting my ability to choose? Am I affecting someone else's ability to choose in a negative manner? And maybe I'm doing something to them. Maybe I'm trying to manipulate them, and I'm getting them to believe something through my own lies. Or maybe I just live in a certain way. I know that let's use my wife as an example. I know that the women's movement, the Me Too movement, and I think the general topic of men respecting women, especially because that's the gist of this entire thing with our podcast and everything. It's how we interact with other men and how we interact with women. I think the biggest thing that I've always tried to take away when my wife will interact with me is, am I respecting her? Am I manipulating her? Am I helping her achieve her ability to choose unobstructed the best way that she can? Am I encouraging her? This is your choice. I will love you no matter what you choose. If you ask me what color the dress is that you should wear, and you're just looking for my opinion, I need to understand, why are you asking me that? Yes, here's what I think, but no matter what you choose, honey, I love you. I want you to understand I respect you. I love you. No matter what it is that you choose. Choose what you like. You be you.
I love this discussion we're having. We're going to wrap up this episode right now, you guys, and pick it up again next week with Dr. Rocky Wright here. We appreciate you being here, man. Thank you so much for what you've contributed. I can tell I'm going to want to have you back more and more. It's a good thing you live close. Because I'm afraid that I'm going to bug you with this every few months probably. So I want to wrap this up. In the next episode, we're going to talk about how we can keep realistic expectations of ourselves and other people, how we can be rational about the meaning of things. We're going to talk about understanding cause and effect and see better what is happening, and then the value of mentors and using other men to help us make good decisions. Thank you for joining us. Until next time, Alpha Up.
Gentlemen, you are the Alpha, and this is the Alpha Quorum.